Okay, this video is on open market operations, which is your book refers to it as the first of the tools of monetary policy. So at the bottom right of page 721, Tools of Monetary Policy, our book actually says there are four main tools. Okay, open market operations, the reserve ratio, the discount rate, interest on reserves. We're going to talk about open market operations. In this one, we've already talked about the other three. So open market operations, as your book says on the next page, consist of bond market transactions in which the Fed, the Federal Reserve System, either buys bonds or sells bonds, U.S. securities, the T-bills, T-notes, and T-bonds, outright or uses them as collateral on loans of money. We're not going to get into the details of the new fancy methodology that the Fed has developed since 2008. So your book talks about that, collateral loans that are based on bonds that that bank holds at the Federal Reserve. We're not going to worry about that. Not going to be on the AP exam. When you start studying finance, if that's what you go into, you'll get the details of that in your college level classes. For right now, we're just going to keep it very simple. KISS, you know what that means. Keep it simple, stupid. And we're just going to talk about buying or selling federal bonds, okay? All right, so I've got several graphs on the board behind me here. The money market, which I was talking about in the last video, the supply of money is fixed by the Federal Reserve. They can either expand it or they can contract it. When they expand it, it reduces interest rates in the economy. That's called an easy money policy. It's also called expansionary monetary policy. When they contract the money supply, when they reduce the money supply by reducing the amount of excess reserves and reducing the bank's ability to make new loans to people, that drives interest rates up. That's called a tight money policy. That would be known as contractionary monetary policy. That's what you do in times of inflation. We haven't had a lot of inflation in a long time. You have to go back to the 1980s and 70s to get a time when we had a significant amount of inflation. There was a little bit of an inflation scare in the early 2000s, but it hasn't been out of control in a long time. So contractionary monetary policy hasn't been around for a while. The Fed was raising interest rates earlier this school year. We talked a little bit about it in the first semester. We weren't doing macroeconomics, so we didn't talk much about it, but I did bring it up from time to time. And that was because the Fed was trying to normalize interest rates to get them back into a reasonable range, somewhere between 4 and 6%, hovering around 5% is kind of a reasonable range for interest rates in the United States. Following the crisis in 2008, interest rates had been hovering extremely low. And in Europe, they'd even hit zero and below zero in certain cases, which is an odd situation, which you'll learn more about in college. So let's just keep it simple here. Remember that the reason that we care about raising or lowering interest rates is so that we can influence businessmen to either spend more, borrow more money and spend more, all determined by the investment demand curve, or influence businessmen to spend less by raising interest rates and slowing inflation down by having businessmen not spend as much money. That's the whole purpose. And that results in an impact on the aggregate demand curve that I was talking about in the last video, but I didn't draw it for you. Here it is. We're drawing it. The price level and the GDP. This is the ADAS graph that we learned about when we were studying fiscal policy. The long run aggregate supply curve at full employment output. Okay, Y sub F, full employment output in the economy. You can just barely see it there at the bottom of the screen. So what does expansionary open market operations look like? What is expansionary monetary policy? Now, before I go into that, remember that your book said, and it is true, that open market operations are the primary method of monetary policy in the United States and have been for a long, long time. Your book insists on going into detail about how open market operations influenced the economy prior to 2008 and the changes after 2008. We're going to focus pretty much on the changes after 2008, but really what I'm going to teach you is the same thing I taught students even before 2008, that when the Fed buys bonds, who do they buy them from? They either buy them from banks that hold the bonds or from rich people who own the bonds, private citizens or corporations that may own the bonds. So when the Fed buys bonds directly from a bank, it gives the bank that much cash. If it buys a $10,000 bond from the bank, $10,000 go into that bank's reserves. That bank can then lend out that money and expand the money supply. So buying bonds or buying securities has the effect of increasing the money supply. Okay? Buying bonds increases the money supply because it increases excess reserves, allowing banks to make more loans, expanding the money supply, reducing the interest rate. Okay? The next part of that linkage is businessmen borrow more money and spend more money. The next part of that linkage is that's a component of aggregate demand. That shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, and we get an expanding economy. Now, if we start off in a bad position here, if we start off with aggregate demand way back here, AD, I'm going to call AD sub zero, sub naught. What do we call this? Well, if this is where we're operating, Y sub zero, if that's where we're operating, then we have what? A recessionary gap, right? Remember that? Okay. What do we need in a recessionary gap? Well, a few chapters ago, we were talking about fiscal policy. We need expansionary fiscal policy. What we're talking about in these chapters is what monetary policy do we need? And again, we need expansionary monetary policy, and that's buying bonds. Purchasing those bonds causes businessmen to buy and spend more, shifting the AD curve to the right, getting us back to where we need to be. That's what we're going to see happening, what we are seeing happening already, starting in late March through April, into May, and through the summer probably. The Fed is going to be buying securities, whether they're government bonds or whether they're some kind of corporate bond or packaged mortgage securities, whatever it may be. The Fed's going to be buying up a lot of that, supplying a lot of liquidity to the banks, excess reserves, and trying to keep interest rates low, even lower than they are now, and getting businessmen to spend more money and getting the economy going again. Okay, so that's expansionary open market operations, buying bonds. Now, what if they buy the bond from a private individual or a corporation? They either buy it from Microsoft or they buy it directly from Bill Gates himself. Well, Microsoft or Bill Gates is going to deposit the cash the Fed gives them for the bond into their bank, and it becomes excess reserves, which expands the money supply. Okay? So whether they buy the bond from a bank or from an individual or a corporation, it expands the money supply. What if we were in a situation where our equilibrium was way out here, we were at AD2, we were suffering inflation, price level is going up. Here was PL1, price level is being driven up, PL2. We're in a time of inflation. What do? The Fed sells bonds. Now, it didn't tell you something. The Fed basically induces people to either buy the bonds that the Fed is purchasing, or the Fed can sell bonds to banks and individuals by making these people a deal they can't refuse, to use a little Godfather terminology there. Okay? How do they make a deal you can't refuse? If the Fed wants to buy bonds, they simply offer a high price. They offer to buy this $10,000 bond at $11,000 or $12,000. And the bank says, we'll gladly sell you that. That's a huge profit for us, for one thing, just a capital gain profit, but also now we've got that money that we can lend out and make money on. So the Fed simply offers them a price. They say, we've got to sell you the bond. We're stupid if we don't sell you the bond. And so the Fed is buying the bonds and the banks are selling them to the Fed at very high prices. How does the Fed get a bank to buy a bond from it? In other words, the Fed wants to sell the bonds and they want to induce the banks or individuals into buying the bonds. They offer these bonds at incredibly low prices. A $10,000 bond is now going for $9,000 or $8,000 or even $7,000. You mean we're going to get this $10,000 bond that we're going to cash in 10, 15, 20 years for $10,000, and you're going to sell it to us for only $7,000? We'll buy it. So the individual banks and corporations and individuals are willing to buy these bonds from the Fed. The Fed is selling bonds to them. And of course, they have to pay for the bonds. So they got to take the money out of their bank account. Or if they are a bank, they got to take the money out of their reserves and give it to the Fed to buy the bond. And of course, what does that do? It reduces the amount of excess reserves and causes the money supply to shrink. Okay, so the money supply is going down now because the Fed is selling bonds to the general public or to the banks, and that's how open market operations work. That's all you need to know. If you can explain what I'm yammering on about right now, you got it made. And of course, when they sell the bonds, reduce the amount of money, it drives interest rates up, businessmen spend less, and the AD comes back to the left, and we stave off further inflation. Okay, so that's monetary policy. And I'll go over some homework questions in the next video.